Hello, my name is Peter Raymer. Welcome to today's session on DynamicsCon. First, I want to thank DynamicsCon for inviting me to speak. I've been really excited for this session. Thank you again to all the viewers for upvoting this session. This session is going to be on chain of command fundamentals. This is a live session, so I will be here in the chat. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, and I'll answer questions as this session's playing. And then at the end of this session as well, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So please type questions in the chat, and we'll work through them. So again, thank you so much. We're going to talk about chain of command fundamentals in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. Before we move forward, my name is Peter Raymer. I'm a director with RSM. I work as part of on Microsoft Dynamics AX, Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. I have a special focus on commerce and working with the point of sale development. And I love helping different companies and people kind of accelerate their business using software. You can check me out on YouTube and my blog articles, as well as on LinkedIn and Twitter. Okay, so by the end of this course, hopefully you'll know how to use chain of command. You'll know what it is on a bunch of different types of objects, tables and forms, form data sources, form data fields, and classes as well. Chain of command is just really important. So before we really jump into the meat of this, I wanted to share all these different references. I've actually written different articles and YouTube videos on a lot of these different topics. Specifically how to use chain of command on these different objects, along with examples and example code where you can copy those values. So please feel free to check those out and use this as a great reference guide as you're doing your own development. So this first introduction is really, this is kind of the URL and blog article if you want to follow along on what we're talking about first, and each section I'll have this similar URL. So what is chain of command? What's this session about? Chain of command is the term that describes how we customize or extend base Microsoft objects and code. So Microsoft in D365 has all of their code. The source code's visible to us. We can see it. We can debug it, which is great. We can use it as an example. But starting in D365, we can't actually make changes to that code. We need to instead extend the code and put code in separate classes and not make direct changes to that code like we could in AX 2012 and before. So if you're used to coding away in previous versions of AX and now you're using Dynamics 365, the chain of command is a core concept that you need to understand. So why can't we modify base Microsoft objects? And this is key to understand of why we're doing this in the first place. So the reason is that before we could make changes to the code, but it meant that anytime Microsoft came out with new features or new hotfixes to the code, it meant a developer needed to merge those changes with a client or third party's custom code. And that was really time consuming. It was costly. It meant that companies really didn't take hot fixes or new features as quickly as anyone would have liked. And so in D365, Microsoft came up with this great new architecture that includes chain of command to work around this. Now Microsoft has their base code, and whenever they have new hotfixes and new features, they can release those, and we can apply those directly to the environment over top of their existing code, and knowing that they aren't overwriting any customizations or extensions. And then meanwhile, we actually have custom extensions and code separate that is not being overwritten that extends the existing platform. And then together, they're really compiled together to form the overall solution. So it's just a fantastic tool. It means we can take those hot fixes, fix anything that's not working correctly just that much faster. So if you're actually interested in, there's this great story that Michael on LinkedIn put out or wrote this article about the history of how chain of command came about this, who invented it, and kind of their story as they put this together. But chain of command is extremely popular. You may be familiar with event handlers and delegates from before. Chain of command is kind of a different way of doing that. And I won't get into maybe all of the debate of, okay, which one's better. I will say that I really like chain of command for its readability and the ease of use in which you can code with it. But I definitely recommend you read this story, as it's pretty interesting and shows just the innovative ways Microsoft has come up with to solve a key problem that has existed for a lot of years. Okay, so I've got a few questions for you as we go through this, just as a way of helping make sure that you're following along and understanding all these pieces. So true or false, base Microsoft source code can be modified in D365? The answer is false. We cannot modify the base Microsoft code. That's why we need chain of command or event handlers. So what is the main reason code cannot be directly modified anymore? Is it because developers aren't careful enough? Visual Studio can't connect to the standard code? Microsoft releases periodic updates that might conflict with custom code, or all the above? Well, hopefully it's not A or B. That's not true. So the answer is C, is we've got periodic updates from Microsoft that we want to be able to take without having to do a lot of merging. And in fact, we don't have to do any merging. We kind of apply this code together, and then we just do some regression testing. You can use RSAT if you want to help make sure that everything's working as expected. So on this slide, I'm kind of reminding people you may have worked with classes before, and specifically inheritance, extending a base class. Really, chain of command is similar, but I'd say it's different. We do not use this extends keyword. We're not doing this as like an extension of a base class, but it is similar in that the compiler is going to kind of combine this code underneath the covers to run the end result. So let's consider an example. So this is our key example that you're going to find on Microsoft's documentation, and let's really talk through this one, and then we'll get into some other examples in a few minutes. So let's say we've got a class, Business Logic 1, and it's got a method called do something. Well, this is base Microsoft code. Let's pretend it's base Microsoft code. We can't actually modify any of the code inside this method. But what we can do is use chain of command to add code either before the method call or after the method call. And there's some key rules that are going to be repeated over and over again in this lesson of exactly how we implement chain of command. First is we need to use this extension of attribute and tell the system about our new class and what base class or table method or form data source method, any of those that we are adding code to. And what's going to change is this little function right here. Right now we're saying we're extending a class string, and we're actually telling it the name of our class, Business Logic 1. We're going to use a different function each time. We don't want to just pass in a raw string into this extension of function, because then we won't necessarily get compile errors when we change, say, the name of a class. So by us using this function, if we've typed in the name of the class wrong, we'll know it at compile time, and we can fix that issue. The next rule, and I'll list these all out here in a second, is that we need to use this final keyword. on our class. We're not allowed to do chain of command on a chain of command class. So this tells it that, okay, we can't extend our class any further. The next rule is we really need to use underscore extension as part of our name of our class every single time. And as a best practice, we want to include the name of the class here as well. It's actually, you'll get a compile error if you don't have underscore extension in your name at the end here. Next thing, we're going to copy the method definition exactly the same as it's shown on the base method. And so that's fine. And then kind of lastly, we use this keyword next to actually call the base method. So we say next, do something. That's going to call all the code that's on that base source code. But we can actually put code in front of it. We can put code after it. We can add additional parameters and add to what we pass into this method. We can take the response that we get out, do something entirely different with it if we wanted to. That's probably not a good idea, but that's the power of this. So you can kind of think next as similar to if you're used to using another language like base or super. It's a little different here. It's just used in chain of command to represent us calling the base method first and then moving on. So I'll get into an example here in just a minute. Let's look at another question. What attribute keyword do you need to use when using chain of command? Extension of, chain of command, extends, or inherits. And the keyword is extension of. We need to use this function at the top in an attribute to tell the system, hey, this is the class that we're doing chain of command on. All right, true or false? Chain of command extensions are performed by writing code in a class. This is true. So even if you're extending a form or anything else, you always create a new class to extend that code. All right, so here I've kind of broken up the different pieces of our chain of command. We kind of already went over this, but another recommendation that I have is when you're naming your class, you want to often give it a prefix. If you're working as a third-party company, that helps you recognize that this is custom code. You want to really use the name of that base object. So in this case, business logic 1, every single time you're doing this code. Otherwise, if you name it something totally different, developers going to have a really hard time finding your chain of command class. I just ran into this recently where code wasn't running how I expected it to, and I had no idea why. And it turns out there was a chain of command class that was adding more code to it. But unless you're able to find that chain of command class by its name, you may not know it's there. Another tip that I have is to use an underscore object type underscore as part of your name. This isn't mandatory, but I recommend it because you're going to have there's objects in D365 that have the same name. So for instance, there is a table named sales table, and there's a form also named sales table. Well, if you want to do chain of command on each of those objects, you might name it sales table underscore extension. But you can't have two objects that are pointing to two different objects behind the scenes. At least you wouldn't want to. So by having two classes, one called sales table underscore form underscore extension and another one called sales table underscore table underscore extension, that helps keep them separate. You can see them, you can find them more easily with what you're looking for. So we talked about what the keyword next means. One of the things that commonly trips people up is they think that they can just put code in here without calling the base method. You have to call the base method. And certainly you want to. We want to include whatever code Microsoft's already put in. We want to get their new code, their hot fixes to these methods. But if you really want to, say, change what you're passing in or change the output, you can do that. I'd recommend you be extremely careful because otherwise you might really break and undo the functionality of what that method's doing. If your base method returns an object, your chain of command method must also return the variable, just as this one's doing right here. All right, so let's maybe jump into a quick example and we'll see what we can do. So here I'm in a D365 Azure development environment. It's a cloud hosted environment. I've got a project and I've got some sample classes and tables for you to look at. So let's just look at this one right here. So I've created a chain of command class. I've named it tutorial some random class underscore extension to really follow our common format here. And then the key piece here is I've added this attribute. An attribute always has an open close square bracket. I've called this extension of, and then I've used this function to tell it what class am I modifying. I'm modifying the class called some random class, and we can look at my some random class. It just has a method do something that returns a blank, and I have a method also add two numbers that adds two numbers. So I can take chain of command and I can say, hey, my do something that doesn't do anything, I can call it. In this case, it takes an integer, but it totally ignores the integer and returns a string. So that's kind of a strange method. But I can pass in whatever integer I want. I can get out that blank string, and I can decide, hey, I actually don't like that blank string. I want it to do more than that. And I can change the result to hello world and return that. So that's the power of chain of command, is we can put code before or after. But again, unlike maybe this example, we want to be very careful to really maintain what the base Microsoft code is doing and really just add additional scenarios to it. Maybe you've got some validation that you need to do and you need to make sure that you're adding an additional validation for your custom field. Or maybe you've got an init value call and you need to set an additional custom field to a default value. We'll look at some of those examples here in a second. So here's another example. I've got my add two numbers. I've copied that method definition to be exactly what it was in the base one. Oftentimes I like to copy the whole method and then just clear out the middle. And then I'm calling next in my base method. I'm passing in the parameters, same way, same number of parameters that I did before. And then I'm just doing printing out the result. In this case, I could cheat and change this to subtract two numbers and say, you know what, I think result should be A minus B instead of A plus B. Again, not a good idea, but just want you to show you what you can do and for you to be really aware of this kind of thing. So our next piece is this extension of class. This is actually kind of what we already covered, so I'll kind of go through this a little quickly. But when you are extending and doing chain of command on a class object, you need to use the class string in your extension of. That's really the only difference, and this is going to be the main difference that we have in all of these different object types of how we use chain of command. So remember these kind of 5 steps, and remember what method you need to do based on what type of object you're extending, and that's really all there is to it. So true or false, the next keyword is a chain of command, or in a chain of command method is optional. And the answer is false, so remember that. You're going to get a compile error if you don't have a next call in your chain of command methods, and that next keyword is calling the base code. So here's another more complex example. You can actually, you can't look this one up, but here I'm doing chain of command on the MCR picking workbench class. I've called it with a prefix. I've called it underscore class to make it more identifiable, underscore extension. And then I've copied the method exactly how it would be with the same number of parameters. I've called next. In this case, this method doesn't have a return type. But then I want to do some more work on top of it. I want to do a while loop through the code, and I want to insert more records in a table than what I've got. So that's just another example of chain of command. One of the best ways to learn this is just to look at a lot of different examples, whether it be online or in your own code. So let's look at an extension of a table next. So here we're going to cover this same slide essentially over and over again, but when we do chain of command on a table, The main difference is we're going to use this function called table string, and we're going to provide the name of the table that we're going to extend. So that's really the only difference between doing chain of command on our class. So here's an example. We've got or a few different examples here. Extension of table string table to extend. So I just made up the name of a table. Maybe we have a delete method and we want to do something after we call delete, or anytime the system calls delete. Maybe we've got a can submit to workflow method or a caption method. We can put code before or after these methods anytime we call it. Here's another example. So we want to extend the sales table method. So all those methods on the sales table, we can create a chain of command class, and then maybe I need to change how a display method works, or in this case, I can actually add additional methods here that I call within a chain of command class. And I'll show you that more in a second. My recommendation for you is to always find and look for a chain of command class first and add to that existing one rather than create additional ones. If you've got 5 chain of command classes that all extend the same object, that is allowed, but that becomes really confusing if you're trying to look for code. So let's go back to another example. I've got a table example where we're extending custable. So pretend that you've just added a new custom field to custable, you've extended it, and you want to set its default value. Well, you can do that by overriding, or really doing chain of command on this init value. Normally you'd override the init value, add your own code, but because this is a base object, we can't just do that. We need to do chain of command to implement this. So we've got our extension of table string, name of the table, we've got final, we've got underscore extension, we've got the method name exactly, or method definition exactly as it would appear if we were to overwrite it. We are calling next, and then this is here where we can then say this dot, whatever the name of my field is that I want to set it to, pretend it's account num, it's not. I can now set this to my default value, and then voila, we're good. Anytime someone clicks new on a form that uses this table as a data source, this init value method is called by the system, and it's going to call the base code and set anything that's in there, and it's going to also call my chain of command method to set a value. So really learning the different common scenarios that you might run into, and then thinking about them in the terms of chain of command is key. And practice is kind of the key here. So we kind of looked over this. Maybe you're extending custable and you've added tutorial loyalty member. You create a new class. You can set that loyalty member to a default value if you want, whether it's an enum or a string or whatever that happens to be. True or false? Another question. And feel free to put these answers in the chat as we go. Test yourself. I ask these questions so that you focus on what are the key things that I really need to remember from this list. And if you have any questions about a particular answer or have your own questions, please feel free to put those in the chat as well. So true or false? Extensions of extensions are supported. The answer is false. So we cannot have an extension, a chain of command extension of another chain of command extension. We can have multiple classes that are all chain of command methods, or chain of command classes that do chain of command on one method. That can happen, but we can't like daisy chain link and say, okay, this one comes after this one. You might be working in an environment where there is multiple third parties that all want to extend the same base Microsoft method. That's allowed, and actually Microsoft states we can't know which chain of command is going to get run first. So if there's 5 different classes, all written by different people, different models, and they all extend and do chain of command on that same method, we don't know which one's going to run first. So you don't want to test it and go, well, okay, mine's running last, so I'll do something a little differently. That's not a safe way to code according to Microsoft. So we need to make sure that we keep in mind that our method might not be the last one to run. So maybe we need to do chain of command on the method that calls that method if we need to make sure we're changing the result in a way that's just safe for us. So really keep that in mind. We cannot keep in mind, or we can't know which one's first. Let's look at another example, extension of form methods. So you're on a form, maybe there's an init method is really common that we need to do chain of command on. Same steps, right? We're going to do an extension of, but instead use form string when we name our form. Everything else, all these 4 steps or 5, 6 steps are really all the same. So here's a quick example. We want to extend the sales table form, probably one of the most common things to extend. We've got a chain of command extension of form string. We tell it the name of the form. Final class, in this case I've got a prefix to help me know that it's a customization. Sales table underscore form underscore extension. Have to have this underscore extension. Then I'm implementing this init method, or doing chain of command on this init method. I've got next init, so I have to call the base one. I want to do that first. That it's going to initialize all my components, run all that base code, and then maybe I've got some additional code. This is where it gets a little fancier, but I'm essentially registering an override method, and I'm actually implementing a jump ref. A jump ref is a little bit beyond the scope of this course, but it's that when you have a blue text and you can click on it and it drills into another form, that can happen through some relations, but you can override that and say, no, I want it to open a different form than those relations are set up, or the properties on those tables and forms are set up to do. I want it to open my own form. You can do that by overriding the jump ref, and I can do that by adding code in this init method. Well, one of the tricks is, how do I get to a particular string control on a form? And I'm going to show you a few examples and point you to some references, but that's a little bit where we're getting into advanced topics of chain of command. But one of the things we can do is we can say this.design. That's going to give us the design of this entire form. We can then say control name, and we can pass in the name of our control. In this case, I have to use this method, or I want to use a method called form control string. I give it the name of the form and the name of my control on the design, and you can look that up in Visual Studio on that form. I'm going to assign that to a local variable called form string control, and then I'm going to use this fancy method called register override method to tell it which method I want to use instead of kind of the base one. This is, again, a little complex, and it's a little bit harder than if you could just write the code on your own custom object, because in your own custom object you could auto-declare the control and just call it directly. But here we aren't allowed to modify that to auto-declare our own objects. So we need to get to it in a little bit more of a complicated way. And I'll show you some more examples, but usually once you know these few different examples, they kind of cover most of your scenarios. So keep an eye out for these as we go through them. All right, when do extension methods run in relation to other extensions on the same method? Alphabetical order of the model name, alphabetical order of the name of the extension class, or indeterminate. So that's what we just talked about a minute ago. They're indeterminate. We can't know when our chain of command method is going to run relative to other chain of command methods. So we just need to keep that in mind as we're going through this. Let's look at another example, extensions of form data sources. So form data sources can have their own methods like execute query or init. So how do we do chain of command on that? But before we get to that, another question. what keyword needs to be used in the class definition of every extension class: public, final, static, or extends. And the answer is final. So I think that's been, number 2 or something like that on each one of these bullet point lists as we go through it. Oh, see, here we go. It's number 3. Here we go. So when we're doing chain of command on a form data source, this gets slightly more complicated. We have to use the method form data source string, the name of the form, comma, the name of the data source. So if you're doing chain of command on the sales table form and the sales line data source, we would say sales table, comma, sales line to tell it which data source. But everything else about this is the same. One key thing to keep in mind is if you want to get the currently selected record, you can use this dot cursor to get that currently selected record. So that's most of the time what you want to do when you're working with data source forms. So let's look at that in a second. Which keywords allow you to denote that the class is using chain of command on another object? It's going to be this extensions of again. Okay, so let's look at some example data source chain of command. Here's more of a generic written out, the name of the form we want to extend, the data source. We could do an init method. We could do a validate write on a data source. These are all common methods that you may want to extend. Here's more of a real life example. A init value is not just a method on a table. You can also have an init value on a data source. And so here we're overriding the data source. We can assign this to form data source object, and then we can take that data source object called .cursor and assign it to a table buffer variable to get the currently selected record. You could do this .cursor, or you can do it in 2 steps like this if you like. Once we have that currently selected record, we can overwrite or set a value to be something different than what it is just in the base code. And then we're set. So in this case, I'm hard coding, setting the payment terms to always be a set value. Hard coding, something's not a good idea, but you get the point for this example. All right, here's another example. So an active method gets called every time you select a different row on a form. And so we can do chain of command. We give it the form data source form name as well as the data source. And then we write out the active method the same way it's written in the system. And then we are adding our code afterwards. We're getting the currently selected record. And in this case, we're adding more to our lookup for a delivery mode search. So this code doesn't matter quite so much, but this gives you an example of how we might use it. All right, let's do another little hands-on for a couple of these. So I think we looked at forms, and that was somewhere in here, and then form extension. So you can kind of look at a few different options. This is that register override, and then we've got our jump ref method here. You can see that kind of in the blog reference article. And then if we look at the data source example, here we've got another one where I'm doing the active method on, again, the sales table data source and the sales line. So we'll just keep moving along. Another one, extension of form data fields. So on a form, we know that there's methods and there's data sources. We also know that on those data source fields, you can have methods like modify method or lookup method. Oftentimes people want to override those, and so we need to use chain of command when we want to do that for a base Microsoft object. This one's kind of most complicated one yet. We need to use this form data field string function here, or method, and then we're going to give it the name of the form to extend, the name of the data source, and the name of the field on that data source. Once we do, that tells the compiler, okay, take our code, merge it essentially with that base code, and run it at runtime. So here's a few more examples. We might want to do validate on a field. So here's kind of a generic example. Here's a real example. We're going to do chain of command on the ABS test form, the cuss group data source, and specifically the cuss group field on the cuss group tables data source. So we can do this where we take this and we use this fancy function any to object to get out this form data object. Once we have a form data object, we can do data source to get the data source. Then we can do cursor to get the currently selected record, and then we can override it. We can set it to something more than what it was when we modified it. So whenever someone modifies name, we're essentially going to change the name and add some more text to it. A kind of a silly example, but what I wanted you to see here is some of this code in here is how do I actually get to my currently selected record on these field data sources. If you kind of have one example, you can just follow along with that and you should be good to go. Okay, what syntax is used to get the currently selected record? .record, .cursor, .row, .value. And so in chain of command, we need to use B, this .cursor. All right, let's look at an example as we're getting close here. So we have another data source field. So sales table, sales line, item ID. We want to put code in the modified. It's a really common thing that you might need to extend. We're going to use this form data field string method, and voila, same as before, we're getting the currently selected record, and then we're going to set the name field based on what item you just selected there. We're going to fill in the name for you. So extension of form control. So another key piece is maybe you've got a button which is a form control, and you want to, I should say a button or another field that is just a control. You can use this method right here, form control string. You give it the name of the form, name of the control. Maybe you need to implement the clicked method or override the clicked method on a particular button. So here's exactly that example. ARB test form, we've got the execute button that's already there. We want to do chain of command on the clicked method. We need to call next, but we've got this same code, any to object, to get the button control. We've got similar code to get the data source and get the currently selected record, and then we can do some additional logic and say, okay, only call or run this code if the currently selected record is a certain value. Which one of these is a form control that's possible to extend? A table named sales table, a form named sales table, a button on the sales table, form named process. So this is the only one that's actually a form control. So a bit of a trick question here, this C option. All right, so the last one we have real quick is a data entity. So data entities are kind of like tables. They're really just views, so they can combine multiple tables together. And basically, because of that, we actually use this same function. We use table string, and then we can give it, oops, I think mistake right here. We're going to give it the name of the data entity in this table string. And so we can look at that real quick. If I've got the sales order line V2 entity, I'm going to use the table string to help validate and have the compiler tell us that this is the object we want to do chain of command on, and we're going to do validate write on it, and then all the same rules apply. We can put code before our next or after our next to kind of change the value. Okay, so with our last little bit here, these are some references again to all these different subsections. If you want to see a video on just one piece, or you want to see an example source code, please check out these different references. So yeah, my name's Peter Raymer. Thank you again so much to DynamicsCon for inviting me to speak. Thank you again to the viewers that are attending this session and who voted for the session. Hopefully you learned something. This is such a key topic for knowing how to develop in Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. Please check out my YouTube channel and blog, LinkedIn and Twitter for other really great tutorials. And again, I'll be on for these next 10 minutes to answer your questions. So please go ahead and put them in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, Hello, thank you. We're back. Let me know if you have questions and we'll get started. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you've got questions or post in the chat, and I'm happy to try to answer them. Thank you so much for joining my session. All right. And if there's no specific questions, that's fine. I know if I'll start talking about a few questions that I saw in the chat, which is, yeah, what does it take for a developer to get rolling with D365? And chain of command is probably the most important thing that they need to know about. It allows us to modify code in D365. We can't modify that base code, but we sure can extend it with either chain of commands or event handlers. Some people ask me about, okay, which one should you use? I really prefer chain of command because we can put code before a method and after a base method call and see that all in one place. I think the syntax is a little easier to write out a chain of command attribute at the top than event handlers. Event handlers, you can right click on them and copy like some generated code and paste it in your code. But I just think those are a little bit more verbose, but it's still important for us to both understand event handlers and chain of command, because for sure you're going to see it in both places. So yeah, I think a lot of developers, when they first start working with D365, if they've worked with AX 2012 before, they might be a little shy. But that's where I think as they watch this type of session, play with it for a few days or a few weeks, then they should get up to speed. So Bobby, you asked, what other resources do you recommend for developers to upskill? Definitely learning LCS, which stands for Lifecycle Services. So that's lcs.dynamics.com. That's really important to understand. That's the portal where we get to see our environments. We can log into the back end of our environments. We can open a developer machine where it's already connected. Understanding how to do that is really key. Understanding how packages get applied, both Microsoft ones and our customizations, is really important. There's some more advanced features of refreshing a database that you don't necessarily need to know how to do, but understanding from someone how we move code from a dev environment forward to test and then later to a stage in prod is definitely all different in D365. We're not working with XPO projects anymore. So understanding that's really key. Understanding how to work with that source control and checking it in, and DevOps is also important, but those are some of the main concepts. In D365, we have models instead of layers like we did, and so kind of understanding that. Randy, you said not all methods are COC capable, correct? That is totally correct. So methods that are private, we cannot do chain of command on. Methods that have like a hookable attribute, those are more rare. Those we cannot do chain of command on. So that's unfortunate. Microsoft, I think, has made a lot more of their methods public. But we can always request into Microsoft if there's a particular method you'd like to run chain of command on and it's set as private. Let's ask them in the next hotfix to make it public. Ideally, it'd almost be great if all of the methods were public, or almost. That would give us more flexibility. I think you can, if you find a private method, go to the method that calls that method and see if that one's public. And if that one is, you can do chain of command on that. You might have to duplicate more of that base code, which is not ideal, but it can still work around that. Mark, you asked what's the best way to transition from AL Business Central to X++ F&O. So that's a fair question. I think once you know a lot of these codes, certainly coming from Business Central, there's a lot of those similarities. I would shamelessly plug my blog. It is dynamics365musings.com. I can paste it in the chat as well. But in there, I try to cover all the core basics of development. How do I create a table within D365? How do I create a form in D365? How do I create chain of command? How do I create a new model? How do I move a model? A bunch of those core pieces that I teach to our new associates Those are what I also create blogs about and YouTube videos on. So I see that as the core things that someone needs to work in if they're new to Dynamics or D365. So that's probably my best recommendation. Certain ones you might be able to skip through faster than others, but that's a really good question. Other questions? This has been really fun, guys. I know we just have a few minutes left. Again, thank you so much to DynamicsCon for setting this up. It's been amazing. And thank you all for upvoting my session. Thanks for checking out my YouTube videos and articles. And thanks for all the comments that you've posted. It means the world to me. Some of the really great positive comments you've gotten. If there are other topics you want, even in the future, I know we're doing DynamicsCon live here, I think in September, so not too long away. If you have topics for those, definitely let me know, or some other session that we can create. Otherwise, yeah, if there's more questions, I'm happy to answer for the next minute here. But I just wanted to make sure you knew how grateful I am. I think chain of command, as you play with it more and more, is really great. It's also important to know if you're not writing brand new code, maybe you're reading or debugging existing code, there might be chain of command methods that are getting called. I got stuck recently where I was calling a method, I was debugging through it, and one parameter value seemed like it was set to one value, and then inside the method it was something else. And I'm like, what is going on? Is X++ broken? And I should have thought way sooner that, oh, maybe there's chain of command running. And so being able to look for it, kind of anticipate that it might be there, can save you a lot of heartache if the code's not working how you expect. So learn to look for it. If you follow those naming conventions that I specified, that'll help you find it, and other developers find it as well. Awesome. Yeah, I think we're just about at time. Again, thank you so much. If there's other questions, please find me on LinkedIn or anywhere else, and I'd be very happy to answer them. All of you have a wonderful rest of your day.